Hello and welcome to the Underhive. Today we are back with some more How to Command the Death Guard, and particularly I want to talk about the new stratagem coming with the Arks of Omen Grand Tournament Pack, Heroic Support. So just to reiterate that, use this stratagem before the battle when you're mustering your army. If a detachment ability would limit the number of times you can include a unit in that detachment to 1, you can include a maximum of 2 of that unit in the detachment instead, and you can only use that stratagem once. So within the Death Guard specifically, that's applying to 2 keyword or profile names. So that would be the Lords of the Death Guard. You can only have 1 of those because they're jealous of each other, as well as only being able to run 1 Demon Prince. Now, of course, they do include an ability Lord of the Death Guard, and in the Codex, they still have the keyword Lord of the Death Guard, but that did get FAQ'd, so they don't fall into both categories themselves. Now, as far as the Lords of the Death Guard, if you were wanting to run really cheap and just go with a double Chaos Lord, firstly, you don't need to do that in Arks of Omen because you're only required to take 1 HQ within Death Guard, so you wouldn't have to double down on 2 cheap Lords just to fill slots. But if you did want them for the cheap rerolls, then I could definitely see some merit in going for 2 cheap Death Guard Chaos Lords. It does also open up the possibility to run Typhus alongside a Lord of Contagion. Now, as it goes, personally, I feel that Typhus is a little bit underrated. I think the package you get together with the potency in melee equivalent to the Lord of Contagion, alongside that Poxwalker buffing if you are running the Poxwalkers, and on top of that being a Psyker, really does bring some extra value despite that additional cost. So I do think Typhus is a little bit underrated generally, but we don't see him in competitive lists, and ultimately there's probably a reason for that. Many of those players will have tried different units out and landed on the ones that they had the most efficacy with. So fair enough if other people aren't seeing Typhus in that spot. Now, he has been the MVP for me in a good few games, really turned the tide, but of course, that could have just as easily gone the other way and him flubbed out and not saved the day. So I can understand why not everybody jumps on the Typhus bandwagon. But I don't think there's really that much merit to having a Lord of Contagion alongside of Typhus. From the motivations I've heard anecdotally and looking at the lists and what I can sort of draw from them, very often the Lord of Contagion was put in there to fill that HQ slot and just be a little bit of output once they can get in. One of the major drawbacks of the Lord of Contagion and the Lord of Virulence as well as Typhus is their slow movement. Now, of course, you can strike them in, but again, you're losing a turn of movement, perhaps a turn of casting if we're talking about Typhus, and ultimately the opponent can counterplay that, screen you out, keep you honest. So it's not always that big a benefit to have the model off the table, depending on the matchup that you're in. Particularly with Arks of Omen having free reserves now, we may see more things go into reserve and come out later in the game. So that could open up pockets for the strike-in from the likes of Typhus and a Lord of Contagion. But again, I don't see that being that high value to really warrant spending a CP on in order to bring both. I don't think you really need both in a typical list. But where it gets interesting for me is the big bad Demon Prince. Now, of course, the Demon Prince is less durable than some of the other lords. And so if you were taking just one and you were yeeting them out into the middle of the board to make use of that big damage profile on the Hellforged Sword or the Demon Forge Axe, ultimately you could lose that Demon Prince against a wide variety of targets. Most characters in the game have a profile where they're going to be able to put him on 4-up, if not his 5-up invuln, or perhaps even take that invuln away and make those saves very, very difficult. Now, there are rumours of certain rules going away, which I won't indulge at this point. We will talk about them in a couple of weeks when the release comes out and whether or not said rules go away. But if there is some amount of reduction to the Demon Prince's durability through the removal of a certain rule, then of course that does put them on the back foot a little bit more because yes, they've got that massive damage output, but they're not actually that durable, aside from the additional toughness, of course. But that brings me on to my next point as well. despite them being intents and purposes an infantry model, they're a former Death Guard Marine that has been ascended to Demon Princehood. They are, in fact, a monster, meaning they don't breach through ruins. And given the amount of terrain on, tournament standard layout, having to walk around those ruins rather than go through them is a significant penalty. And whilst the Demon Prince does have that additional movement, perhaps just as an effort to compensate for that, ultimately that may not be enough. And so the wings are a very popular choice. I didn't used to run wings when I first started playing, probably because the boards I was playing on didn't have enough terrain on in the grand scheme of things. But playing on tournament style layouts or trying to include an appropriate amount of terrain to give a balanced game regardless of the matchup, the Demon Prince does feel slow still, or at least in my opinion. So I certainly think having the wings on them is worth that additional 25 points, because having the ability to fly lets you skip over that terrain. Of course, not when you're charging, but if you position well enough with that significant movement that you'll have from the wings, ultimately you should be able to get a decent looking charge without having to go through terrain that often. And so the question being, is two Demon Princes a good thing? And I think the answer there is yes. I'm certainly looking at lists myself at the moment of how two Demon Princes as the only HQs will look in a given list. Now, I had this from a couple of comments, so of course, firstly to you guys, you gave me the sort of inspiration to look at this, but I've had a little look at whether or not Flash Outbreak becomes more appealing with the double Demon Prince, because of course you can Flash Outbreak onto a Fetid Bloat Drone, another fast moving flying unit, and of course you're going to have the availability to have multiple drones if you want them anyway. But I do think with having the Demon Prince in there, something like Ferric Blight becomes very, very interesting. Again, particularly if we're considering that some durability related rules might go away. But that additional AP on there can be very tasty, but my conclusion overall is that Flash Outbreak isn't any more appealing with a double Demon Prince than it would be with a model with a Contagion Warlord trait and a Bloat Drone that, again, can move as fast as a Demon Prince, can also fly, and is looking to get in the middle of the opponent. On top of that, the drone there isn't really any less durable in the grand scheme of things. It's going to hold up under the same sort of attacks as the Demon Prince would. So I don't think there's any real incentive to yeet a Demon Prince up just for the benefit of a Flash Outbreak, unless it's really going to turn the tide of a given game. I do still think that as far as if you go in for Fetid Virion, particularly the Blight Spawn, Ferryman is still very interesting, but I do think that the second and third play companies are still probably the way to go for a competitive build, mainly in the second for that strat to reduce the charge distance by 2 or count as being 2 inch further away, whichever way you want to look at it. And again, with the third company for that Contagion Warlord trait to deny rerolls, still very, very potent. And of course, even seeing Death Guard lists with no Arch Contaminator, I think is a nod to the fact that Votann shutting that down is a major hamstring to the list. So my envisage of this double Demon Prince build doesn't necessarily lean into the Flash Outbreak as a gambit particularly, but the Demon Prince having that maneuverability, the massive movement, and the flat 3 damage from the sword with good melee profile is going to make a difference in a lot of lists, in my opinion. One of the ways my lists have fallen down is throwing that Demon Prince out there, getting the kill, but ultimately it trading off, and then not having that character steam left in the army to really go toe-to-toe with something, and having to rely on those cleavers coming through from the Plague Marines. Now, of course, they can turn up the Plague Marines when they've got those cleavers still in the squad, but having that second Demon Prince just gives you firstly another area of the board where your opponent has to be careful how close they get to you, because the Demon Prince coming out and potentially trading isn't necessarily the worst thing in the world for you. If you're not running a ton of other characters, they're probably not taking Assassinate, so losing the model isn't going to be that big of a deal. It will give 1 point against Bring It Down, but if you're not going for the Oops All Demon Engine list, then again, you're probably not giving up Bring It Down too easily by running the double Demon Prince. And again, it does open up the psychic secondary options there. By having two, it gives you that flexibility of, do I want to run the Warp Ritual? I've not got to remain in the center with a given Demon Prince all game. I only have to get one in and around the area to try and score that. Or do you go for the Psychic Interrogation? With the movement and fly on there, you're very likely to be able to get in range of an enemy character to attempt that Psychic test and ultimately get your points. Whether or not you'll get the CP on it, again, just comes down to the opponent. The Demon Prince isn't offering anything there. But in terms of scoring the points, I think with the double Demon Prince build, I would be looking at the Warp Ritual, just to give you a few turns off in the game where you can cast the Smite, you can cast a Power, just to be able to sort of turn an engagement around. But on top of that, I think having the reroll ones to hit is not a bad shout. I think really leaning into Arch Contaminator at the moment can be a bit of a liability, mainly for Votann, but there are a couple of other factions out there that'll shut that down. But otherwise, I think just having the hit rerolls alongside the Plague Marines is quite a big deal. But that's my thoughts on it. I do think the double Demon Prince is worthwhile. I'm going to be having my eyes out on eBay at the moment for a second-hand Demon Prince, because I've only got one, and it was the old Forge World resin, so I don't really fancy messing about with that stuff again. But ultimately, I think that is going to be a very good way to go for a low character build. Of course, if you are planning to chuck a load of Fetid Virion in there, you need to be aware you're offering up Assassinate. Again, none of the Fetid Virion or the Demon Prince hold up particularly well under any sort of assault, be it, particularly capable shooting, melee, or psychic unit. They are going to get through those models fairly easily. So again, just being aware you could be offering up Assassinate fairly easy if you do decide to yeet them up the board. Well, I'd be interested to hear what you think. I have put together one list here for the Oops All Demon Engine list. As it goes, I imagine here there's going to be some sort of change, so I've priced this a little bit above the limit. This list comes in at 2,005 points, but again, allegedly there are going to be some sorts of changes to the codex costings, and so as a result, this list may actually come in under the limit. 2 Demon Princes with Wings. And no surprise there why I'd be doing that, given what we've mentioned, and running the Hellforge swords. 3 Fetid Bloat Drones with the Flesh Mowers, of course. 1x3 Mephitic Blight Haulers. 2x2 Mephitic Blight Haulers. So you've got a total of 7 Blessed Blight Haulers in the list, and 3 Plague Burst Crawlers. So of course that's not a valid list right now, but when Arks of Omen release, it is. You've got your 1 HQ in the form of a Demon Prince and, say, the 3 Bloat Drones as your 3 required fast attack slots. You fill in a further 3 fast attack with the Blight Haulers, perfectly fine, and you fill in 3 heavy support with those Plague Burst Crawlers. So ultimately, will be a legal list. Now, I don't think that's going to be anywhere near as strong as with 8th edition Epidemius slotted in as a reinforcement, because you're not getting that incremental bonus as your demon engines get kills. But I do think it's still in a very good place against hyper elite armies like, say, Chaos Knights and Knights, and also into things like Votann that aren't necessarily considered hyper elite, but they are quite expensive per model. You've certainly got the output there to deal with the likes of a land fortress in a given turn, if you can roll well enough. And of course, you've got that pitter-patter from the likes of the lighter weaponry on the Blight Haulers Plague Burst Crawler. And of course, you've got that melee output from the Flesh Mowers and the Demon Princes once they get into melee. As I say, if I was running that list, you're not going to be running Spread the Sickness, unfortunately. I think realistically, you might be better off cutting one of the Blight Haulers and including a couple of small units of Poxwalkers just to try and score some points on an easy Spread the Sickness. But otherwise, if I wasn't taking that, depending on the opponent, you're definitely going to be looking at Bring It Down or Assassinate or No Prisoners, something to get the kills, earning you some points. You're not going to be looking at banners or anything like that. So you're certainly going to have to look at a Psychic secondary. And realistically, I think you're probably taking 2 out of the 3 there. Either Assassinate or Bring It Down. No Prisoners if it's relevant. If not, grind them down. And then Warp Ritual with that sort of list. So you are going to have to keep one of those Demon Princes alive, at least for the first 3 turns, whilst you try and score your Warp Ritual. But after that, you can kind of fire and forget them, treat them a bit like your bloat drones, but with that bigger melee output. Do I think it's that effective a build? No, not really. I don't think it would win tournaments, but I do think it's a pretty solid gatekeeper build. I definitely think if you took that to a tournament, you'd come away with a win or 2, and in the hands of a solid player, you could definitely go positive with that sort of list, depending on the opposition. But again, I think it's a little bit too skewed to really warrant a serious approach. But if you've got the models, perhaps a friendly game, definitely worth a try. I think that would be quite fun. Well, thank you so much for watching. If you want to get involved in the comments, please do feel free to. Always really means a lot to me, and I will read them and get back to you. Otherwise, thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you next time in the Underhive.